The reforms put into law in 2017 and subsequently have set a course for the country under the leadership of the president. And now Uzbekistan needs to actively pursue that course and realize the economic benefits of these ambitious plans. Everyone in this room has a role to play in fulfilling Uzbekistan's potential and to participate in a way that is both economically and personally rewarding. Helping affect change is something we can all feel really good about. For those in the room, first, are we all getting translation where necessary? I'm going to take that as a yes. Doesn't seem we need many of those in the room. How many of you, those in the audience, are considering starting or bringing a business to Uzbekistan? So, you've now heard more than you wanted to on my opinions. Let's hear from our real experts facing the challenge of governing Uzbekistan's state-owned enterprises. If all goes well, we'll first hear some prepared comments from our two government officials, and then we'll hear some prepared comments, I believe, from Mr. Shevchuk and Mr. Turetsky. After these presentations, we'll mix it up a bit, and I will ask some questions of our remaining panelists and invite follow-up comments from our presenters in the remaining time available. So, first, I invite Director General Vafayev to speak to us about the role that the ASR is going to play in the transformation of corporate governance in Uzbek state-owned enterprises. Thank you, Mr. Vafayev. If you'd like to offer some prepared remarks, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Briggs. Dear ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists, let me first of all thank you for attending today's discussion. And as we discuss a critical topic and issue of corporate governance and improving corporate governance at the state-owned enterprises, we of course would benefit and learn a lot from your collective wisdom, your collective experiences, and would appreciate all views and thoughts shared through this discussion. Let me briefly introduce the agency probably. The Agency for Strategic Reforms was established by the President of Republic of Uzbekistan, His Excellency President Mirziyoyev, with one important role to create an institution which will play a catalyst role in all reforms, basically. And by actively collaborating with all institutions and state agencies involved in designing and implementation of these reforms. It doesn't mean that we're going to do functions of policy making or running the ministries. Our role is to bring them together to establish a truly collaborative environment and help them in defining and also implementing important policy measures which support overall reforms program of our president. So given that, we are trying to build an agency which is a pretty new institution as a very dynamic, forward-thinking organization which is dedicated to support innovation, attract talents, and cultivate, as I said, one of the most important factor of success of reforms, as we believe, strong collaboration and coordination between different players, including the private sector, including foreign investors, in the process of developing and implementing policy measures and reforms. Going to the topic of our today's discussion, it's of course obvious that there is a strong correlation between good corporate governance and performance of enterprises. And as major state-owned enterprises were handed to our agency through expansion of mandate, and we play a role of the shareholder on behalf of the state in these institutions. This issue is not just theoretically important for us, but practically key for the agency in order to improve financial performance, operational performance, effectiveness and competitiveness of state-owned enterprises under our management. And of course, we have very well developed international standards, namely, first of all, OECD, corporate governance principles and rules and guidelines, which we can use and apply. But I think one should also realize and admit that we are working in a quite dynamic emerging market situation, and I believe that just copy-pasting and replicating somebody's experience is not efficient enough. And this is where the challenge is how to choose right sequencing, how to prioritize tasks, and how to focus on most pressing and important issues at this particular time. I hope that with support of our partners, with support of our development partners especially, with support of independent directors and investors, we'll be able to continue making good progress in the area of corporate governance, especially at state-owned enterprises level. What is providing additional comfort is that the issue of corporate governance and the need of improving it, which was quite alien for any government, for most of the government officials just a few years ago, now became important. Everybody appreciates and realizes how critical is it for making enterprises successful, making privatization resultative, and improving overall performance of our real sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fafayev. Next up, I'd invite Mr. Ordakov to share the perspective.
Да, большое спасибо.
Davlat aktivlarini boshqarish agentligi demak davlat aktivlarini boshqarish sohasida vakolatli davlat organi hisoblanadi va o'z faoliyatida davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni boshqarish faoliyati bilan shug'ullansa, bir asosiy yo'nalishlaridan biri bu bo'ladigan bo'lsa, ikkinchi eng katta va bugungi kundagi eng dolzarb masala bu xususlashtirish bilan shug'ullanadi. Shu bilan birgalikda yana bir qator qo'shimcha vazifalarimiz bor. Bu demak to'lovga qobiliyatsizlik jarayonini tartibga solish, baholash jarayonini tartibga solish va realtorlik faoliyatini tartibga solish kabi faoliyatlarni muvofiqlashtiradi. Savolga qaytadigan bo'lsak, korporativ tamoyillarni boshqarish tizimini yaxshilash bo'yicha oxirgi yillarda ko'plab ishlar qilindi. Endi to'g'risini aytish kerak, bir qotib qolgan demak boshqaruv tizimini zamonga, hayotga moslashtirish bo'yicha katta ishlar qilindi. Eng asosiysi bu O'zbekiston tarixida, mustaqil O'zbekiston tarixida bo'lmagan davlat mulkini boshqarish to'g'risidagi qonun qabul qilindi. Mana yaqinda 9-martdan boshlab kuchga kirdi. Ya'ni mana shu o'tgan davrda shunaqa qonunimiz bo'lmagan ham o'zi. Qonunni o'zi yo'q, lekin shu jarayon boshqarardi. Bu institutsional eng katta qilgan ishimiz hisoblanadi. Qonunni eng asosiy jihatlari shundan iboratki, bu davlat mulkini boshqarish sohasidagi vakolatli organni belgilab berilyapti. Mulkdor va tartibga solish vazifalarini belgilab beryapti. Umuman davlat ishtirokidagi korxona, davlat korxonasi, davlatda ishtiroki kabi bir qancha normalar bor. Mana shularni demak qonun bilan aniq belgilab berilyapti. Shu bilan birga bu mulkka respublika mulki va munisipal mulk ekanligini ham tan olinyapti. Kim respublika mulkini boshqaradi, kim munisipal mulkni boshqaradi, qanday u shakllanadi, mezonlari kabi masalalarni yoritib berilyapti. Umuman davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni qanday tashkil etiladi, ularga qo'yiladigan cheklovlar. Endi to'g'risini aytish kerak, yaqingacha har qanday vazirlik, idora ham, davlat ishtirokidagi korxona ham o'zi ulush kiritish yoki qo'shimcha bir obyektlarni sotib olish yoki ulushga kirish hisobiga qandaydir yangi davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni yoki davlat mulklarini paydo qilib qo'yaverardi. Mana shunga ham qat'iy cheklov belgilandi bu qonun bilan. Va yaqinda muhtaram prezidentimizni navbatdagi islohotlar bo'yicha qarorlarda mana shuni qat'iy mustahkamlab qo'ydikki, endi bu davlat korxonalari va davlat vazirlik idoralari o'zicha qandaydir korxonalarni ocha olmaydi yoki mulklarni sotib ola olmaydi. Albatta bu qat'iy ravishda davlat aktivlarini boshqarish agentligi bilan kelishilgan holda va buning uchun asoslari yetarli deb topilgandagina tuzishi mumkin. Buni qanday qilib biz nazorat qilishimiz mumkin? Bu xabaringlar bor. Demak, davlat xizmatlari orqali korxonalarni ro'yxatdan o'tkazish jarayonida mana shu bo'yicha bizni davlat aktiv agentligining xulosasi bo'lmaydigan bo'lsa, ro'yxatdan o'tkazmaydi yoki kadastr organlari ham bu jarayonni ro'yxatdan o'tkazmaydi. Mana shunday bir cheklovi ijrosini ta'minlaydigan tizim yaratdik. Albatta hisobdorlik masalasi bu qonunda birinchi masalaga olib chiqildi. Ya'ni davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni davlat va jamiyat oldidagi hisobdorligini ta'minlash, barcha hisobotlarini ochiqligini ta'minlash bo'yicha vazifalar belgilandi. Mana shularni jamlab bir yilda bir marotaba demak davlat aktivlarini boshqarish agentligi O'zbekiston Respublikasi Prezidenti, Vazirlar Mahkamasi va Oliy Majlis palatalariga hisobot taqdim etadigan yangi tartib joriy qilindi. Umuman har yilgi mana shu davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalar faoliyatini tahlil qilib, biz 1-oktyabrgacha mana shu davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni o'zini kelgusida faoliyati nuqtai nazaridan bu davlat ixtiyorida qolish kerakmi yoki xususiy sektorga o'tish kerakmi degan sot yoki tushuntir degan tamoyil asosida biz xatlov o'tkazib, har yili mana shunday bir xususlashtirish dasturlarini kiritib boramiz. Mana oxirgi 3 yilda har yili shunday dasturlarni kiritib boryapmiz. Mana yaqinda oxirgi dasturimiz demak 24-mart kuni qabul qilindi. Bu to'g'risida keyinchalik yana axborot berib o'taman. Umuman korporativ boshqaruv tizimini takomillashtirish bo'yicha bir qancha ishlar qilindi. Bu asosiy e'tiborli tomoni kuzatuv kengashlari, mana shu davlat korxonalarini boshqarish bo'yicha kuzatuv kengashlari va ijro organi rahbarlari 1 yilga tayinlanar, saylanar edi. Mana shuni davomiyligini ta'minlash, islohotlarning davomiyligini ta'minlash va qo'yilgan vazifalarni bajarish nuqtai nazaridan va ertangi kunga ishonch nuqtai nazaridan buni 3 yilga uzaytirildi. Bu tegishli qonunlarga o'zgartirish kiritish yo'li bilan amalga oshirildi. Endi yana bir e'tiborli tomoni mana shu kuzatuv kengashlariga barcha davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarda kamida 1 nafar mustaqil a'zolarni bo'lishi ham belgilandi. Ya'ni ilgari faqatgina davlat, vazirlik, idoralarning vakillari bo'ladigan bo'lsa, endi demak xususiy sektor ishtirokchilari, umuman professional boshqaruvchilarni ham taklif qilamiz. Albatta bugungi kunda bir qancha korxona, 57 ta korxonamizda mana shunday demak jami 100 ga yaqin mustaqil kuzatuv kengashi a'zolari faoliyat ko'rsatishyapti. Bu hisobdorlik tizimi bo'yicha ham demak har yil natijasi bo'yicha davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni qanchalik samarali ishlaganligini ochiq oydin e'lon qilib borishni ham boshlaganmiz. Hammalarga ma'lum, o'tgan yildan boshlab bir qancha o'sha korxonalarni hisobotlarini e'lon qildik. Qancha 1770 ta korxonani demak 2021-yil yakuni bo'yicha hisobotini e'lon qilgan bo'lsak, ulardan eng ko'p sof foyda bilan ishlagan aniq 20 ta ro'yxatini ham e'lon qildik va zarar bilan ishlagan 20 ta korxonani ham alohida e'lon qildik. Ya'ni odamlar ko'rsin, jamiyat bilsin, kim qaysi davlat korxonasi yaxshi ishlayapti, qaysinisi o'zini qo'yilgan biznes rejalarini bajara olmayapti. Investorlarni demak jarayonlarga ishonchini shu aksiyadorlik jamiyatlaridagi ishtirokini aksiyalarni sotib olishga bo'lgan ishonchini oshirish maqsadida davlatda oltin aksiya degan demak maxsus huquqi bor edi. Qonun bilan mana shu ham bekor qilindi. Ya'ni qandaydir kichkina ulushga ega bo'lib, oltin aksiyaga ega bo'lib, boshqarishda ko'p katta vakolatga ega bo'lgan funksiya ham mana shu demak bekor qilindi. Umuman mana shu ishlarni davom ettirgan holda mana shu amalga oshirilayotgan islohotlar natijasida aksiyadorlik jamiyatlari to'g'risidagi qonunni o'zini ham qaytadan takomillashtirishga to'g'ri kelyapti. Shuning uchun bu yil biz bu qonunni yangi tahrirda ishlab chiqamiz. Mana shu barcha o'zgarishlarni hisobga olgan holda va oldimizda turgan yangi vazifalarni hisobga olgan holda bu qonunni yangi tahrirda ishlab chiqib, biz barcha muhokamalar, xalqaro moliya institutlarining fikrlarini olgan holda biz hozir hammalariga murojaatlarni yuborganmiz, o'zlarining takliflarini berish bo'yicha. Shu demak bu qonunni ham zamonaviylashtirish va realiyaga yaqinlashtirish bo'yicha yangi tahrirda ishlab chiqamiz. Bu yilgi eng katta institutsional vazifamiz bo'ladi. Endi ikkinchi katta yo'nalishimiz va juda ham bugungi kunda dolzarb mavzusi bo'lgan masala bu xususlashtirish masalasi, davlat ishtirokini qisqartirish. Mana demak barcha iqtisodiyot tarmoqlarida modernizatsiya va diversifikatsiya jarayoni amalga oshirilyapti. Muhtaram Prezidentimiz hamma sohada buni boshlanishini o'zlarini barcha qarorlari, ko'rsatmalarida belgilab berganlar. Shuning uchun demak davlat ishtirokini qisqartirish bo'yicha ham juda katta topshiriqlar bor. Bu o'sha 2020-yilda 29-dekabrda murojaatnomalarda, har yilgi murojaatnomalarda demak xususlashtirish bo'yicha katta vazifalarni belgilab beradilar. Hammalarga ma'lum, mana shu oxirgi 2021, 2022 va hozirgacha bo'lgan davrda 2 milliard dollarga yaqin davlat korxonalari, davlat mulklari, ko'chmas mulk obyektlari xususiylashtirildi. Ya'ni xususiylashtirish hajmi 2 milliard dollarga yaqin yetib bordi hozirgacha. Demak, ekranda ham chiqyapti. Mana shu hozirgacha bo'lgan xususiylashtirish nimamizni men tarqatib material qilib hamma ichidagi axborotlarni sizlarga yetkazdik. Yana qo'shimcha savollarga javob beramiz. Lekin eng asosiy ma'nosi biz mana shu oxirgi 2 yilda 500 dan ortiq davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni xususiylashtirishga muvaffaq bo'ldik va 600 ga yaqin davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni demak faoliyatini o'rganib chiqib, qaysilari tugatildi, qaysidirlari demak boshqa tashkiliy huquqiy shakliga o'zgartirildi. Endi mana kecha forum doirasida O'zbekiston Respublikasi Prezidenti o'z nutqlarida demak yangi xususiylashtirish dasturi 1000 korxona, 1000 ko'chmas mulk va 40 ta yirik davlat korxonalaridagi aksiyalarni IPO qilish bo'yicha yangi xususiylashtirish dasturi qabul qilinganligini va buni ko'lami jihatdan eng katta hozirgacha bo'lgan xususiylashtirish dasturimiz ekanligini aytib o'tdilar. Albatta bu 1000 plus 1000 plus 40 degan nom berdik mana shu xususiylashtirish dasturimizga. Nima degani ma'no? Bu demak mana shu 1000 ta davlat ulushlari, davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarning ulushlari demak aniq ro'yxati belgilab berildi. Ular bosqichma-bosqich savdoga chiqariladi va davlat vazirlik idoralarining balansidagi, davlat korxonalarining balansidagi bugungi kunda demak xususiy sektorga taklif qilish mumkin bo'lgan 1000 ta ko'chmas mulk obyektini ham biz auksionga chiqaryapmiz. Albatta bu qanday bo'ladi? Bu katta korxonalarimizdagi davlat ulushlarini biz o'tgan tajribalarimiz asosida va hozirgacha erishgan eng yaxshi tajribalarimiz asosida professional kompaniyalarni jalb qilgan holda demak bu konsultantlar orqali xalqaro jarayonlarni tatbiq qilgan holda xususiylashtiradigan bo'lsak, ko'chmas mulk obyektlariga keladigan bo'lsak, bu qoida tariqasida auksion orqali elektron auksion tizimi yaratilgan. Mana shu tizim orqali xususiylashtiriladi. Bu O'zbekistonda juda ham ommabop bo'ldi xususiylashtirish e-auksion tizimi. Bugungi kunda 4 milliondan ortiq ishtirokchi mana shu demak e-auksion tizimida ishtirok etyapti. Mobil ilovasi ishlab chiqilgan e-auksionni demak mobil ilova orqali auksionda ishtirok etib kuzatib turish imkoniyati yaratilgan. Hozir 250 mingga yaqin demak bugungacha hozir yuklab olingan mana shu mobil telefonlariga. Mana shu orqali demak uni chekka-chekkalarga yetib borishi, mahallalarga yetib borishi, hamma odamlar foydalana olish imkoniyati ko'paytirilyapti. Endi 40 ta xalqchil IPO dasturimizda katta kompaniyalarimizni demak mana aytib o'tildi. Navoiy tog' metallurgiya kombinati, Olmaliq tog' metallurgiya kombinati, Bekobod metallurgiya kombinati, katta banklarimizdagi o'rtacha 2% ulushni olyapmizda, lekin uni aksiya soni ko'p. Shuning uchun buni ko'proq aholimiz qatlamlariga yetib borish uchun bitta aksiya, bitta lot tamoyilini qilib buni demak aholiga taklif qilamiz. Buni ham demak ommabopligini hammaga yetib borishini ta'minlash uchun demak tegishli investitsion maslahatchilarni jalb qilgan holda barcha demak nimalarni korporativ tamoyillarga amal qilgan holda birja qoidalariga amal qilgan holda investitsion maslahatchilar bilan ishlab, faqatgina uni aholiga sotishi e-auksionni platformasidan foydalangan holda sotmoqchimiz. Lekin u aksiya bilan bog'liq barcha rasmiylashtirish ishlari fond birjasida amalga oshiriladi. Va keyinchalik fond birjasi uchun bir katta demak resurs paydo bo'ladiki, shu odamlar, tashkilotlar o'zini qo'lidagi aksiyalarini keyingi ikkilamchi demak oldi sotdi ishlarini faqatgina fond birjasida amalga oshiradi. Bu bilan biz fond birjasini rivojlanishi, kapital bozorini rivojlantirish uchun sharoit yaratib beramiz. Albatta, investorlarimizni qiziqtiradigan masala bu kompaniyalarning boshqa IPO tizimlari. Bu bo'yicha ham alohida qarorlar bilan katta kompaniyalarimizni, davlat banklarimizni bir qism ulushlarini IPO orqali sotishga, IPOga chiqarish ko'zda tutilgan. Bu bo'yicha demak u alohida tartibda ish olib boriladi. Umuman olganda barcha sohada, barcha iqtisodiyot tarmoqlarida xususiylashtirish jarayonlari hammaga bu yetib borgan. Ko'pchilik aytishi mumkin, hozircha kichik korxonalar bilan demak xususiylashtirish ishlarini amalga oshiryapsizlar deydi. Lekin katta korxonalarda ham bu ish boshlangan. Lekin biz katta korxonalarni, masalan, O'zbek neft va gaz, havo yo'llari, issiqlik elektr stansiyalari yoki avtoprom kabi katta kompaniyalarni xususiylashtirishi biz hali qanday buni amalga oshirish kerak? Uni qandaydir ulushini sotishimiz kerakmi yoki ichidagi zavod, fabrikalarni alohida olib chiqib sotishimiz kerakmi degan va umuman bugun xalqaro investorlar va o'zimizni ichki mahalliy investorlar shunday katta kompaniyalarni sotib olishga tayyormi degan savollarga aniq javobimiz bo'lmaganligi uchun bunga professional kompaniyalarni yolladik. Masalan, O'zbek neft va gaz bo'yicha Rothschild bilan ishlaymiz, xususiylashtirish strategiyasini ishlab chiqish bo'yicha. Issiqlik elektr stansiyalarini xususiylashtirish strategiyasi bo'yicha KPMG bilan ishlaymiz. Havo yo'llari bo'yicha Deloitte bilan ishlaymiz. Xuddi shunday mana shu katta kompaniyalar bo'yicha alohida bir professional podxodlar qilamizki, ular bizga jahon bozorini, umuman bugungi sharoitdan kelib chiqqan holda bizga aniq takliflarni berishadi va keyinchalik uni biz hukumatga olib chiqib, buni yechimlarini olib kiramiz. Bu yil demak katta vazifalarni oldimizga qo'yganmiz. Bu demak kamida 1 milliard dollarlik xususiylashtirish hajmini ta'minlash. Buning uchun mana shu demak dasturimiz xizmat qiladi. Uni asosi mana shu bu yilgi 24-martda qabul qilingan dastur. Mana shu 1000 plus 1000 plus 40 dasturimiz asosida biz bu yilgi xususiylashtirishni amalga oshiramiz. Umuman moderatorimiz juda to'g'ri aytdilar. Davlat ishtirokidagi korxonalarni boshqarish bo'yicha, samarali boshqarish bo'yicha qiladigan ishlarimiz ko'p. Bevosita bu moderatorimiz rahbarligidagi kompaniya tomonidan ham yirik davlat korxonalarida tizimlarni yaxshilash bo'yicha professional maslahatlarni berishyapti. Xaridlar tizimini takomillashtirish bo'yicha juda ham yaxshi takliflar berilyapti. Umuman davlat korxonalarini hisobdorligi, moliyaviy hisobotlarini zamonaviylashtirish, xaridlar tizimini takomillashtirish bo'yicha mana shu ishlarni davom ettiramiz. Qanday savollar bo'lsa javob berishga tayyormiz. Katta rahmat.
Thank you, Mr. Ordikoff, for sharing the details of your privatization program. A lot of information. Now let's welcome Mr. Shevchuk, who I believe may have some prepared comments. And otherwise, I got some questions for you as well. But if you'd like to lead with some comments, Alexander, please do.
Peter, if you want, we can discuss the questions. Just.
So there's a tremendous opportunity for foreign and domestic investors to invest through public-private partnerships and privatizations in Uzbekistan. Two related questions. What's most attractive about the ASR and USAMA programs from the investor's perspective? And what are the greatest risks and concerns for investors? So what are the upsides of what you're hearing, and what concerns are you asking about as we learn about these programs?
No, I think that the main question is what comes first: transformation of corporate governance and privatization, or privatization or transformation. So the exact problem of chicken and eggs, or eggs and chicken. The correct answer, in my view, both components are important: transformation and privatization. However, depending on the development stage of each company, it's necessary to find the right balance between the depth of transformation and the speed of privatization. And I would point out 4 aspects which are important. The second one: if the government and state team chooses the optimal way of privatization in each case of state-owned companies, this will also have a positive impact on the ability of private companies to raise capital as well. International institutional investors are closely watching new markets and analyzing all public actions with state as an owner of state-owned companies. So it's important to understand that such actions should be consistent and predictable, as unpredictability keeps investors away. It's vital to try to create a success story with each case, as growing number of such stories will eventually increase portfolio investments in the country. The second one: privatization roadmap. For each large state-owned company is an essential tool for the investors and the state, I hope. The roadmap should cover different privatization options, considering the specific of the industry, privatization goals, and regulatory dependence of the company. Sectoral and monopoly regulation should be considered separately, and as well as social tariff burden. The monopolies require individual approach from my perspectives. The third one: we think that split of the companies into the different groups will be helpful. For example, market-oriented companies, semi-market-oriented companies, and fully regulated. Success in privatization in regulated companies heavily depends on investment assessment and readiness to pay for the quality of current state regulations, and more important, regulation in the future. And finally, the fourth one: in case of selling and controlling stake to a strategic investor together with placing a minority stake among portfolio investors, of course, it's important to assess not only the expertise of the new controlling shareholder, but also the access to technologies and equipment. Sometimes it would be more important than the access to the capital. So all of these 4 approaches maximize the valuation of privatized companies, but it's highly important not to overprice the company. The difference in good placement versus bad placement is the upside in valuation left for investor. If you price the privatized company correctly, in consequent placements, you will benefit from higher multipliers and due to the trust and demand in placements of state-owned companies.
If I could just express an opinion on that. If you just use the present value buttons on your calculator, governments looking to sell assets worry terribly whether they're realizing the best prices at the time of privatization. But in the long run, and if we're using our present value buttons, the future value in economic growth, job creation, and tax basis for the state is far more important than whether you get the marginal 10% on the purchase price at the time of, or valuation at the time of privatization. More important to get on with it. I'll ask you a related question to that. You brought up the topic of operating performance versus improved governance standards. I'll put a finer point on it, finer point on the question. Which one will investors pay for? Are investors more likely to attach a higher valuation to a company where the state has gone to great efforts to clean up governance before privatization, or improving operating performance, particularly when an investor, depending whether they're a minority investor or have some kind of board influence or control, is likely to change governance once they have made their investment, or hopefully will have a positive impact on performance. That's why they've made the investment. So which one, and this is good guidance to our government officials, which one will the investor pay for? Which one will they value more? Performance or governance?
You know, of course, it depends on each case in each company, because the current situation in each company could be different. And in some cases, if you do not transform the company and prepare to the IPO or SPO, you can get more than 10% discount. And I think it could be critical in some cases. But the answer to the question is similar to the privatization transformation dilemma. Both operational efficiency and corporate governance are critical to investors. It is so because there are many cases when corporate governance and operational efficiency were negatively affected by the change of shareholder control, for example, shareholder control capital structure, and subsequent changes in the strategy and the management of the company. So we have relations between corporate governance and operational efficiency. So if you would like to increase operational efficiency, I think you need to increase corporate governance efficiency. That's all.
So one more tough question for you, since you seem to have an appetite for it. Should Uzbekistan focus on governance transformation and operational transformation and then privatize, or vice versa? Privatize and let the new investors in the market determine how to transform? Which should be the priority?
You mean the priority between the privatization and...
I'll put it another way. Fix then sell, or sell then fix?
It depends on the cases.
Didn't say it was a fair question.
I think that for the large companies, you should have a unique approach. It works like this. And each board of directors of each company, they have their own roadmaps. And of course, it should be not postponed. I mean, the roadmap of privatization. So you can just set up this roadmap, how you should achieve the final goal of privatization. And step by step, month by month, and you should stick to this roadmap. That's all. But it really depends on the cases. You should avoid the same approach for all companies. It's not an efficient way.
Thank you. I've been putting you on the spot. Appreciate your answers.
Mr. Briggs, don't you
Yes.
mind if I just comment? Given that you asked very interesting and important questions. I mostly agree with my fellow panelists here that one-size-fits-all approach would be probably not the best one in the privatization or transformation process. However, I think you asked a very good question and provoking this discussion, and the question of transformation first, or as you put it, fix first versus privatize first. I think it's rather artificial, and fixing, especially in terms of improving the corporate governance by introducing better financial standards, better financial accounting and reporting, better accountability in front of shareholders, it's important. And it's, as is in your example with UK, which basically benefits from its legal system, we look in our reform and privatization process at corporate governance not as a self-objective or objective by itself per se, but rather as a platform, as a tool which enables us to privatize and transform enterprises faster. As far as approach, what comes first, privatization or transformation? Transformation, I think I will repeat the answer here. It depends on the asset. If we are talking about enterprise which is in state ownership, but it's probably not much strategically important for the government for many reasons, why should we spend our efforts and time and resources on trying to fix it and improve it? We better sell it, not caring much about the present value, as you said, and hoping that the private sector would be much better than we in improving the prospects of growing future values. If it is enterprise as very important in terms of resources, and especially resource-based companies, I think we have to be careful in developing right strategy, because the value of this company, it's not in corporate governance mainly, it's not in its equipment or what they have, it's in the resources. And the right valuation of resources is, of course, very much linked to all this overall infrastructure, corporate governance again, of equipment and reporting, etc. So that would require a bit different approach. But let me reassure you that this issue of present value versus future value is important for the government. And we don't see and we don't look at privatization as a process of raising additional revenues for the state coffer. For us, it's much more important part of reforms which aims improving overall competitiveness and overall productivity in the economy, rather than boosting just one-time revenues of the budget. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, and that's a very important prioritization that you've just highlighted. My purpose was to be provocative with my question, and I really am happy that you contributed your perspective on that. So, again, looking from the investor perspective and the challenge of all of this change in governance, let's shift for a minute to Mr. Ikonikov, a noted expert on corporate governance, on the challenges of serving in the role of a director in a state-owned enterprise and in a privatizing state-owned enterprise, which is, through that period of change, has its own challenges.
Sure.
Alexander, where on earth are Mr. Vafayev and Mr. Ordakov going to find all of these qualified and trained independent directors?
Yeah. Good question. Да, спасибо большое. Уважаемые участники сессии, уважаемые организаторы, спасибо за приглашение. Трансформация управления госкомпанией – это такая очень интересная, актуальная тема. И спасибо, Питер, за ваш вопрос. Мы работаем с директорами, обучаем директоров и работаем с акционерами, которые запускают советы директоров. И на постсоветском пространстве работаем со многими агентствами, которые как раз проходят трансформацию, некоторые наблюдения. Вот я хотел бы поделиться и то, как вот это влияет на подбор директоров. И хочу я начать с цитаты Джорджа Лукаса, который сказал, что наш фокус определяет нашу реальность. И, наверное, мы об этом все должны как-то думать, вот и директора, и акционеры, и топ-менеджмент, особенно когда мы делаем изменения и когда мы проецируем будущее. И очень хорошо, что у агентства стратегического развития, агентства управления государственными активами есть фокус, есть вот эти вот компании, стратегические компании. И это очень хорошая основа, на которой можно сделать вообще такие позитивно успешные примеры и даже создать такой вот внутренний пул кандидатов, который потом использовать для дальнейшего развития государственных активов. Мы все знаем, что трансформация – это процесс, это не результат, и поэтому нам, конечно, всем надо определиться, что мы хотим видеть как результат, чему стремиться и за какое время. И во всех странах очень большую роль играет кодекс корпоративного управления, потому что он устанавливает некоторый минимум для компаний, которые они должны следовать, и к чему они должны стремиться. Это некая норма, национальный стандарт. И если компания не выполняет кодекс, она должна об этом рассказывать, объяснять почему, говорить, когда она будет это выполнять. И раскрывать эту информацию публично. Это такой вот хороший стимул. И, возможно, в Узбекистане тоже вот, пришло, может быть, время подумать, посмотреть вот над обновлением текущего кодекса, вот как такого вот стандарта и синхронизации этого кодекса с теми изменениями, которые нужны в законодательстве. Мы в прошлом году вот вместе тоже с коллегами из АУГа, из АИФСИ, с нашими вот выпускниками проводили как раз форум корпоративного управления с директорами и обсуждали некоторые вот направления, которые могут быть улучшены в рамках вот кодекса, законодательства. И на некоторых я хотел бы остановиться, сказать, что первым мы видим, что требуется унификация определения независимого директора. Чтобы мы понимали вот эти вот критерии, а что понимается под независимостью, что понимается под non-executive director, какие у них роли. И тогда, наверное, компаниям и инвесторам будет проще общаться на одном языке. Нужно, конечно, определить, какие квоты у кого, какая должна быть композиция совета, сколько должно быть независимых директоров, сколько non-executive, должен ли быть представитель менеджмента или нет. Мы с Питером эту тему как раз обсуждали сегодня. И вот есть, вот мы видели, что сейчас требование один директор, мы видим, что вот такая практика, что лучше иметь 3 и более. Почему? Потому что одному директору очень сложно выполнить свою роль, очень сложно двигать изменениями. И, конечно, над этим нужно провести обсуждение и принять решение. Еще один момент – это, конечно, сами комитеты, это вот рабочие органы совета директоров. Их нужно описать, их функционал, что они делают, какие требования к кандидатам, кто должен входить в эти комитеты. И, возможно, еще подумать еще над расширением прав крупных миноритарных акционеров в части номинирования кандидатов. Сейчас они могут голосовать за кандидатов, но, может быть, дать им вот это право, потому что мы таким образом можем обогатить вот этот вот пул кандидатов, которые к нам будут приходить. Ну, давайте еще вернемся вот к кодексу. Конечно, обновление кодекса и вот нормативная база изменений – это очень большой проект. И здесь, конечно, нужно понять, вот, кто конкретно это будет делать. В любом случае, это должен быть какой-то единый центр ответственности, потому что если его размывать, то процесс может длиться годами. И вопрос не только написать кодекс, вопрос еще, как его внедрить, как его применить. Поэтому нужна некоторая система контроля, которая позволяет нам наблюдать за кодексом и даже, возможно, какие-то штрафы выставлять и ограничения на компании, которые его не соблюдают. И важно понять, кто от государства это может тоже делать. Мы знаем, что вместе вот с таким контролем и давлением обычно что-то еще как-то бизнес поддерживает. Нужно сбалансировать. И, конечно, нужно сформировать вот эти вот пособия по внедрению, вот обмен опытом, обучение. Такая достаточно внедрение, это большой проект, 3-5 лет. Чем раньше мы начинаем, тем у нас есть больше шансов его, как говорится, сделать вот эту вот норму изменения. Еще один момент, что в процессе трансформации нам нужно менять мышление. И необходимо научиться относиться к бизнесу как к отдельному субъекту и уметь его защищать, в том числе от действий акционеров, и искать баланс, вот баланс разных участников, заинтересованных сторон. И, конечно, совет директоров – это ключевой орган. И в совете директоров важно иметь хороших, качественных, профессиональных директоров. Давайте вот на минутку представим такую ситуацию, что в управление госкомпании зашли такие авторитетные, уважаемые, с высокой бизнес-репутацией люди. Что произойдет? Ну, по крайней мере, качество, как-то восприятие этого актива, его стоимость, его инвестиционная привлекательность, она будет другая, скорее всего, более положительная. Но чтобы такие люди пришли в компанию, конечно, нужно создать для них условия. Для них неприемлема ситуация, когда они принимают какие-то решения, обсуждают, дают рекомендации, а в итоге решение принимается другое, которое иногда даже негативно влияет на активы. Эти люди, они не привыкли быть пассажирами. Они хотят быть частью истории. Их мотивация заключается в том, чтобы поучаствовать в большой позитивной истории роста, создания стоимости. И, конечно, они смотрят на такие возможности под очень пристальным вниманием, потому что если пойдет что-то не так, они потеряют свою репутацию, у них будут сложности дальше с дальнейшей с их работой. И здесь, конечно, еще важен такой технический момент, потому что директорам надо платить. И вознаграждение должно быть рыночное. И, возможно, даже учитывать некий региональный риск, который есть, вот такие риски развивающихся стран. Ну и, конечно, иметь страховку. Как привлечь директоров? Кто этим должен заниматься? На наш взгляд, у акционера должна быть лидирующая роль в подборе независимых директоров. Вот странно выглядит ситуация, когда топ-менеджмент подбирает кандидатов в совет директоров. Потом, понятно, он представляет государство и так далее. Но при избрании этих директоров, эти директора начинают его потом контролировать, смотреть за ним. Определенно есть конфликт интересов. Поэтому, конечно, в государстве желательно, чтобы был отдельный орган. Я знаю, что такая работа сейчас ведется, что комитет по назначению, который вырабатывает критерии для независимых директоров, проводит интервью с ними, оценивает их, и при назначении ставит задачи. Например, мы хотели бы, чтобы с вашим участием в этом году была создана стратегия. Мы хотели бы, чтобы с вашим участием была подготовлена дивидендная такая политика, которую мы потом утвердили. Мы бы хотели, чтобы были разработаны программы мотивации долгосрочные для менеджмента, запущены комитеты и так далее. Но задачи должны быть, они должны стоять. Несколько, может быть, лайфхаков из тех критериев, которые мы используем, работая с компанией. Первое. Хороший кандидат – это тот кандидат, который был уже там, куда вы хотите прийти. Если вы хотите стать компанией $2 миллиарда с рынком в Европе, то должен быть кто-то, кто управлял таким бизнесом и знает, как это сделать. Смотрите кандидатов, у которых есть особая компетенция, нужная компетенция. Сейчас компания выходит на IPO. Нужны люди, которые знают, как работать с рынками капитала. Возможно, бывший управляющий ассет-менеджмента международного будет хорошим активом, который действительно поможет компании подстроиться и выстроить управление в соответствии с ожиданиями инвестора. Нужно иметь тех кандидатов, у которых, мы уже говорили, сильная репутация и у которых сильный нетворкинг, особенно если вы развиваете бизнесы в других странах, рынках, вы ищете партнеров. Конечно, должны быть те люди, которые могут приоткрыть вам дверь и своей репутации, показать, что вы тот правильный партнер, с которым нужно иметь дело. Ну и, конец, очень ценны кандидаты, которые имеют глубокую функциональную индустриальную компетенцию, которые могут остановить государство от непродуманных решений. Я вспоминаю такой пример, когда публичная компания «Аэрофлот» пригласила бывшего CEO МТС, тоже публичная компания. И благодаря опыту, авторитету этого человека удалось остановить и убедить и государство, и менеджмент не совершать невыгодную сделку по приобретению Трансаэро. Может быть, многие из вас слышали об этом. Где брать директоров? Конечно, нужно обращаться в профессиональные институты директоров, у них есть сеть, знакомства, и они уже этим профессионально занимаются. Ну и, конечно, хедхантеры, потому что они могут делать точечные поиски. И в начале пути, конечно, важно использовать тех директоров, которые работали на рынках, где трансформация началась раньше, у которых есть опыт, но в дальнейшем нужно развивать свои местные кадры, то есть своих бизнесменов, собственников, обучать их. И мы в наших подходах обучения, Steam University в частности, мы как раз продвигаем подход, что обучение должно строиться на лучших международных практиках, но с адаптацией к локальному контенту. Ну и в заключение моего выступления не могу эту тему обойти стороной, ее очень часто задают. Кто должен от государства входить в совет директоров? Какая лучшая практика? Кто от государства? Мы знаем, что, конечно, представители государства хотят быть в совете директоров, потому что они хотят иметь тоже некий комфорт, assurance такой, понимать, контролировать, что происходит. Но мы знаем также все, что и есть конфликты, которыми нужно уметь управлять. Но в частности конфликт то, что у госслужащих очень ограниченное время. Они очень занятые люди. Они не всегда могут погрузиться полноценно в работу, в комитеты, выработку стратегии, поиск альтернатив, оценки рисков и так далее. Не всегда, может быть, у них и есть нужная компетенция для того, чтобы принять действительно качественное решение и пройти развилки, очень важные развилки для бизнеса. И второй момент, что, конечно, государство, оно же большое, есть разные ведомства, и тоже есть конфликт между долгосрочными и краткосрочными интересами. Я слышал, что ряд компаний сейчас, пока не очень хорошо показывают финансовый результат, некоторые, я слышал из выступления. Но тоже представьте себе эту ситуацию, когда представители ведомств, министерств, которые отвечают за доход в казну, они находятся в совете директоров и доминируют в своих решениях. Конечно, они будут толкать компанию на то, чтобы они выплачивали такие повышенные дивиденды. И многие компании будут сталкиваться с проблемой, что нужно брать кредиты на рынке дорогие, ограничивать развитие, и тем самым, как говорится, это тоже будет влиять на создание то, что вы говорили, долгосрочной стоимости этих компаний. Это вкратце то, что я хотел сказать, и буду тоже рад ответить на ваши вопросы. Спасибо.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm conscious of time, so we're going to keep moving along here if we can. Excellent insights. Next, let's hear from our change agent, Eric Sagoussis of PIP. I'm going to take these off here, excuse me. Eric, PIP and A&M are similar in that our firms are both in the business of managing change. What are the greater obstacles of effectuating change in state-owned enterprises? Is it the soft issues of change-resistant boards, management teams, and organizations, or the hard issues of financial and operational constraints? In your experience advising these types of companies, what's the hard part? Harder part?
There's always, of course, issues with financing. There's always issues with things like technology. But in our experience, when we work with clients and they expect a silver bullet, it always comes down to people. It is always people, and until we reach the automation stage where we can shut the doors of any enterprise and it will operate on its own without any single human, it will always come back to human behavior. And of course, corporate governance is a huge part of this. It's very important how do we set up correctly the decision-making structures, the incentives, the things that drive human behavior. Because ultimately, it is about the decisions that humans on various levels, from the top, from the ministries, agencies, down to the level of operator or worker in the field. What are the decisions that they make? And changing this behavior and decision-making structure, that's, we find, always the biggest challenge.
If it weren't for the clients, consulting would be really easy. How could governance best be improved in state-owned enterprises to facilitate, in particular, risk-taking and dynamic change? Often we need to make dramatic decisions, and static bodies aren't very good at doing that. So what advice could you offer our officials here in that area?
Yep. Always a challenge, and does come back to the human behavior and human decision-making. And we find that there are probably three key components. First, it is actually having, and some of the colleagues here talked about it before, having clear, specific targets. What actually do we want to achieve? What are we going for? And what good looks like? Not in theoretical and sort of superficial terms or very general terms, very specifically, what are we trying to achieve? And how will we measure, how will we know when we have achieved it? Now, once we have the target in mind, then it is the question about, well, who will execute, who will be ultimately accountable for reaching the target and manage the process. And unless that accountability is very clear and assigned and with clear consequences, which is the third part, then it's very easy to get into a situation when hard decisions need to be made. It's much easier to shift the blame, to delay decision making, to avoid the transformation process, rather than, in the case when there is a very specific accountable person that knows that there will be consequences of executing or not and reaching the goal or not. Which brings to the third point, which is the motivation, which is, why anyone would be incentivized to make a decision rather than avoid a decision. And quite often, and that's not only for state enterprises, it equally goes for private ones. The incentives are not set up for action. So if we want to transform, we need to change that.
Moving away from the psychology of all of this here for a minute, how is quality of data and the management analysis that's currently there and reporting transparency a tool or a hindrance to effectuating operational change and performance improvement? One of the first things we have to do when we go into a business is build a fact base so that we can make good decisions based on those facts. So let's talk about moving away from the squishy stuff here for a minute. Data. We eat data. Talk about that process in this transformation of state-owned enterprises.
Absolutely. And look, we always have to keep in mind that age-old adage that I'm sure all you have heard is that you can't manage what you don't measure. And that's fundamental for all parties involved in the process. And if we take perspective of investors, unless they can see the data, unless they can trust the data, it is just extremely difficult for them to make decisions. So, in my view, extremely important. Just having data itself doesn't solve everything, but it is sort of a hygiene factor that has to be in place for investors, first of all, to take companies seriously, but then also in the transformation process. Again, you can't change, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Thank you. And we're on the home stretch here, folks. I know we're running a little bit long on time, but we've saved the best for last. Our counsel, Mikhail Turetsky. I think you have some comments, but let me ask you a question as a lead-in here. In his speech yesterday, President Mirziyoyev described a plan for privatization of the largest companies by way of IPO. And of course, we've just learned more about the IPO process for the larger population businesses under Osama. IPOs require a lot of technical legal work. What would Uzbek companies need to do basically to satisfy the relevant requirements for successful IPOs?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to our audience. I understand that this session, and in particular my presentation, is the last thing that separates you and lunch. So we will try to be brief. And lawyers are typically boring. So in an effort to keep you entertained, we have 3 short slides. And we also have a handout that's on every chair in the front rows. So if you haven't had one, you can grab one at the chairs. So I was going to speak about 3 things. One that Peter asked about, which is IPOs. Second thing is corporate governance reform. And third is shareholders' agreements. So first answering Peter's question about the IPOs. Our law firm is active in over 50 countries advising on IPOs and corporate governance reforms, so we can see a good selection of what's going on in different countries. And we must say that Uzbekistan is making great strides in the process. It is symbolic that the main agency dealing with these issues is called Agency for Strategic Reforms. So strategy is at the heart of what is being done. And the agency is very transparent about its activities. We heard from Mr. Vafayev at this panel. There was a very good presentation by Mr. Abdulkadirov yesterday at one of the panels. And it was great to hear from Mr. Ortikov in the State Assets Management Agency. So the objectives are articulated and the process is going well, and it is great that the agency and other state bodies are open to ideas of the expert community and ideas of the issuers and other market participants. So in terms of IPOs, probably the golden standard for IPOs is London Stock Exchange or New York Stock Exchange, so one of the established stock exchanges. So on the first slide, which we wanted to leave with you, we have the corporate governance requirements of the London Stock Exchange for admission to listing of major companies. What we have on the handouts is a side-by-side comparison of the requirements of the London Stock Exchange and the requirements of the Tashkent Stock Exchange. We understand that another important objective is to develop the local capital market. So presumably for large issuers, what you would want to pursue is a dual listing when a large company is listed both in London or another major international stock exchange and in Tashkent. In this sense, it is important that the requirements of the Tashkent Stock Exchange are harmonized with what's required on the international stock exchanges. So the key requirements of the London Stock Exchange are unsurprisingly for the board of directors, its composition, the number of independent directors. At the moment, the requirement on the Tashkent Stock Exchange is just one independent director. The requirement of the London Stock Exchange is 3 independent directors, and a majority of independent directors for premium listing. So we also have a certain divergence on the committees. The Tashkent Stock Exchange only requires 1 committee. The London Stock Exchange requires 3 committees. So remunerations, nominations, and audit. An important aspect of the listing requirements in London and other recognized stock exchanges is preparation of relevant policies and also related party transactions. They need to be safeguards for related party transactions. And again, the requirements in London are slightly more onerous than the requirements for the Tashkent listing at the moment. So the level of transactions that require approval is lower in London than it currently is in Tashkent. So all help is available to make sure that the largest state companies in Uzbekistan are ready for an IPO. The requirements are clear, and this process, probably the most important part of this process is the due diligence part. In addition to the formal requirements, when a company from Uzbekistan would be going to an IPO at an international stock exchange, there will be a large crowd of advisors and investment banks and lawyers descending on that company to speak to the management, to understand what's going on within the company and provide helpful insights for how the internal corporate governance could be improved. And after the IPO, there's also an important element of oversight from the international investor community and all the market participants. So this will provide helpful insights for the government as to how things are going at a particular company, at what can be improved. On the second slide, we have a few points on corporate governance. So again, Uzbekistan is making great strides in terms of independent directors. It's great that independent directors can now be selected at a tender. What may be helpful is to experiment with minority investments in large companies. So as a stepping stone to an IPO, you may consider, and I know that already there are some discussions underway, of attracting a small minority investor into the capital of a state-owned company as an interim step. And it would be good to allow this minority investor to bring in, to nominate a director. So this nomination would help provide helpful insights on how the company operates, whether it is IPO ready, and what the next steps could be. An important aspect of corporate governance is equal treatment of shareholders, in particular of the minority shareholders. A really important issue is dividends, that obviously all shareholders need to be treated equally, and if dividends are payable to any shareholder, they have to be payable to all shareholders, and decision on dividends has to be driven by the company's board. So it is clear that a large shareholder may be the government, and the government has its own needs and requirements for the company, but it's important that the dividend decision is with the board, and even if the board comprises representatives of the government, they have to keep the interests of the company at heart, and they have to balance various issues, not just the interests of the shareholders, but the interests of the company and its investment plans. One final point on corporate governance is Uzbekistan currently has a limit of 25% of shares that can be offered and traded outside Uzbekistan. That's a helpful restriction that's aimed at protecting the local market, but presumably in some instances you may want to deviate from this point. Just by way of example, if you would like to have a company admitted not just to listing at the London Stock Exchange, but you would also like it to be included in the various indices, like the FTSE index and various other indices, you may need to go above 25%, possibly above 50% of free float. So exemptions may be required to this overall 25% limit. And on the final slide, on the third slide, we have a few suggestions about shareholders' agreement. As you know, shareholders' agreement can be a useful tool of regulating the relationship between the company and the government. And you may want to consider shareholders' agreements, particularly when you have private investors. We understand that the government would like to privatize companies, but at the same time, the government has its own economic policy, it has its own industrial policy, which often involve these large companies being privatized. So the best way of dealing with that is by being transparent up front. So to the extent there are any expectations on the investor, it would be helpful to specify those in the shareholders agreement. To the extent there are any investment projects planned, it would be helpful to include criteria for taking investment decisions into those shareholders agreements. And as soon as the company goes public, you may no longer be able to have a shareholders agreement because there are so many shareholders out there. But you may still want to have an agreement with an anchor investor. You may still need to have a relationship agreement between the company and the government, because the government, if it retains a 30% or larger interest, the stock exchange would require a relationship agreement to regulate that as well. So shareholders agreement can be useful, and a few things that you may want to consider are governing law in those shareholders agreements, dispute resolution clauses, and various other points that can be discussed in more detail. So these are the 3 points we wanted to cover. If there are any more questions, we can discuss them as well.
Because of where we are in time, I'm going to ask one question. Mikhail, if you want to take a shot at it, and any of our panelists who'd like to add a comment. It's a broad question that we've touched on in many ways. How should, and all of this is about governance of state-owned enterprises in transition, how should independent directors find the balance between the interests of the company, the enterprise itself, and the interests of the state when you are serving as an independent director in a state-owned enterprise? That's the real challenge that you've got. And you could look at that through a legal lens, you could look at that through a practical business management lens, or through the policy lens of the state. Mika, I'll give you as the last speaker, I'll give you the first chance at the question, and then if anybody else would like to add a comment, this is where we will end on that.
Thanks very much, Peter. I can start, and I'm sure others may have views as well. This is a very delicate area because the legal position is clear. The directors owe duty of care to the company. So even if they're appointed by the government, even if they're appointed by a shareholder, they still owe the duty of care to the company, not the appointing shareholder. So the legal response is clear that they have to keep the interests of the company in mind. And obviously it's a balancing act because they are appointed by a certain nominating shareholder.
but they have to keep the interests of the company in mind. Peter, if I may, as institutional investors really interested in proactive independent directors, we think that independent directors, they of course has to go on the interest of the company, and it's not the same as the interest of the management. It's just an interest of the company and all shareholders. In some cases, of course, it could be the case when the interest of some shareholders could be different and the interest of the management could be different, but the main goal of the independent director is just to convince all parties and stakeholders to be on the interest of the company and to think about it. That's all. So it's only one choice.
Alexander?
Yeah, the main responsibility of the director is fiduciary duty, so to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders, stakeholders. And of course, if, for example, you have only one stakeholder, shareholder, the government, then first you should probably develop together with the management alternatives and see whether there are alternatives to pay more dividends or to invest. What is the best? And consider all alternatives and make a just solid and good decision. The more complex situation when you have not only a state as a shareholder, but minority shareholders. And you have to take into account the interests of these groups too. And consider, for example, if the government don't want to pay dividends and, for example, as an example, and to invest in future, then some shareholders might be not quite happy because they want to get some return. And as an independent director, that also should be a discussion, because finally you have to find the solution that would be in the best interest of the business and all stakeholders. That's actually the one of the big dilemma, if you like, that independent directors facing.
У меня тоже. Значит, некоторые комментарии, значит, по привлечению независимых членов Напсовета. Сейчас мы работаем по двум направлениям. Первое — это, значит, мы привлекли на основе конкурса headhunting компания, это английская компания Стрекица. Мы им, значит, как бы поставили, чтобы найти 100 человек для Напсоветов и для некоторых местах исполнительных органов. Сейчас уже компания Стрекица подобрал кандидатов. Сейчас самое важное — это мы ведем переговоры по зарплате, по вознаграждению, поэтому вот этот вопрос скоро решим и уже конкретное интервью по назначению на этот этап выйдем. А в других направлениях, то есть в некоторых крупных предприятиях, например, акционерное общество Новоинский горно-металлургический комбинат, там уже мы внедрили при наблюдательных советах непосредственно подчиняющие на Напсоветы, значит, комитеты, 3 комитета, комитет по вознаграждениям, комитет по назначениям и комитет по аудиту. То есть вот этот комитет по назначениям в прошлом году нам выбрал некоторые членов независимых наблюдательных советов и некоторые руководящие должности, значит, на исполнительный орган тоже кандидат подобрал. То есть работа идет, а по малым, которые сейчас опыт не имеют, такие предприятия тоже есть. По нему Значит, впервые мы вот недавно, 20 апреля, по около 300 мест мы конкурс объявили, исходя из требований закона об акционерном обществе и закона об управлении государственным имуществом. То есть там уже есть ограничения, которые некоторые регуляторные функции осуществляют. Вот их кандидаты они не могут участвовать. Мы даже не будем принимать их заявки. Вот это 300 мест уже мы объявили. Сейчас принимаем заявки по электронной системе Давактив УЗ. То есть тоже механизм внедрили. А то, что Александр сказал, значит, по кодексу корпоративной этики, корпоративного управления тоже разработали с ЕБРР и АБР мы разработали. Скоро мы на обсуждение будем вводить и, дай бог, в этом году будем внедрить в практику нового кодекса. Спасибо. И то, что дополнительно ко всему сказанному, мы, знаете, в законе определили, что не менее одного члена Напсовета, то есть это может быть 30%, 50%. У нас цель до 2025 года это вводить до 30%. И уже в некоторых крупных предприятиях или банках уже 50% тоже есть. То есть критический минимум это не менее одного. Спасибо.
Mr. Briggs, since everybody reacted to your last questions, I think it was an interesting one and useful one. I just want to stress that you see from the answers of Mr. Artikov how much efforts and resources the government and the state invest in selection of independent directors, and obviously we do it not to replicate through these independent and expensive directors rubber stamping boards at government, at state-owned enterprises. And for the state, their major objective is to improve and increase the value of the asset as any shareholder, private shareholder. So we'll be directing all our independent directors to work, first of all, based on the interest of the enterprise and the company. And if somebody tries to mask some ministerial, some narrow objectives with state interests, well, this is where a shareholder can step in, representing the state. So, all in all, directors and all directors, and especially independent ones, should work, first of all, based on the interest of the enterprise and the company. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your comments. There's obviously a huge amount of work to be done, an enormous amount of complexity to prepare in improving governance of state-owned enterprises and in preparing these companies for the ambitious privatization program which has been described. One of my takeaways from this conference is some comfort that the quality of leadership and depth of understanding exhibited by today our government representatives and market participants who joined us on our panel are up to the task, and that Uzbekistan, if it follows through, has tremendous potential to be successful with this program to the benefit of its people and the investors who participate. So please join me in thanking our panelists and wishing our officials the best of luck in achieving their objectives. Thank you very much.